and we'll start. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the prayers that we've been doing before this class. Tonight we're just going to recite this praise to Shakimuni Buddha one time, rather than, I think we've been doing it 3 times, but I think tonight just once. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering. Again, in that 3rd line, there should be an I in front of imagine. So we'll just recite this in English, again, making this vast, pure offering to the merit field, to the Buddhas, all our gurus, so that we can receive their blessings and realize particularly the topic of this chapter that we're studying, develop the perfection of patience and so on. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching, as usual, once in English, twice in Tibetan, and just bring to mind refuge, the sense of safe direction you have in the 3 jewels as we recite the first 2 lines, and then cultivate bodhicitta, motivation for listening to these teachings tonight. And we'll also meditate on that shortly. But let's again, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pesanam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pesanam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay, then as usual, let's do a short meditation, give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, to generate a good motivation as well. So just spend the next few minutes in meditation on the breath. No doubt each of you have some way that you work with the breath currently. And again, do your best to stay with the breath. When the mind wanders, bring the mind back to the breath. Then after a few minutes in silence, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation period. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And as you'll recall in last week's class, in verse 21, we talked about some of the ways that suffering can actually be quite useful for us. To have the experience of suffering can help us in a variety of ways. And we're going to focus on one of those tonight in setting our motivation. The fact that our own suffering is a doorway through which we can connect to the suffering of others. This, of course, will feed into our motivation of bodhicitta. But just take a look at your own life and honestly assess it initially in terms of the coarsest form of suffering, the suffering of pain, the difficulties that are easily identifiable as suffering. And we might think our life is relatively well off, but nonetheless, we all have this to some degree, having to face things that we don't like, be separated from the things we do enjoy, have to deal with aging, illness, even to have death there on the horizon, looming there, never knowing exactly when death will come. A lot of things are obviously unsatisfactory about this life. But just reflect for a moment on those that are sort of the tip of the iceberg, but are certainly a way that we can connect with others because we see others also experience these various sufferings. And then we can also reflect on what the Buddha called the suffering of change, the reality that even when we do get what we want and have ideal situations, those don't last. They're transitory. We have them for a while, then they fade away, and we have to experience the opposite, the pain, the difficulty. So those things are not the solution to everything, even though we put a lot of energy into having that level of happiness and comfort in our lives. We know that it doesn't do the trick completely. In that way, it's unsatisfactory. It's part of what the Buddha called dukkha, this unsatisfactory state that we experience. So reflect on how that's even something we can identify in ourselves and also in others. How others do have those fleeting experiences of happiness, but they're just that. They don't ultimately satisfy. And then finally, the deepest level of suffering is pervasive, compounded suffering. The reality that no matter where we go in cyclic existence, what life we have, even any particular moment of a life, we're always under the control of our karma and our delusions. This conditioned existence is by its very nature unsatisfactory. It's like we are in prison, but we've been in prison since beginningless lives. We've never known true freedom, not for even one moment. And here too, this should be something we can easily understand with regard to all other beings that are in samsara, along with us in cyclic existence, going from life to life. We're all under the control of these factors. So use these three levels of suffering in terms of understanding them for yourself, but moreover, to open to the suffering that others are experiencing. To try to generate the compassionate wish that we all be free of suffering, ourselves and all beings, and the recognition that the best way to accomplish this is for each of us to become enlightened ourselves, to join the ranks of the Buddhas. And in that state, we will have everything we need to help all other beings to be free from their suffering and attain the same state of Buddhahood, enlightenment. So cultivate this motivation of bodhicitta, the sincere wish to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. Okay, good. Welcome to our fourth class in this series on Chapter 6 of Master Shantideva's text. So for those of you who want a little recap of where we were, what we've been looking at, initially this chapter started off with a little bit of an introduction to the subject, kind of giving us an impetus to practice patience by showing the disadvantages of having the mind of anger, and of course a little bit of the benefits of having the mind of patience. Then we went into some of the basic instruction, had that wonderful verse, verse 10, where essentially Master Shantideva says, why get bent out of shape? Why get angry and upset if it's something you can do something about? Just change it instead. But if it's something you can't do anything about, well, then getting upset and angry doesn't serve any purpose. It's useless. And from there, we went on into starting with, I think, verse 12, we began our exploration of the first of the three types of patience. And we're going to hopefully conclude that or get close to ending that tonight. The very first one was this patience that willingly endures suffering, that kind of acknowledges that part of life is having suffering. And so we have to not get bent out of shape by that, but rather accept that and even use it fruitfully, as we saw in the meditation we did tonight, as well as the meditation I asked you to do over the last week, working with verse 21 to kind of show some of the ways that we can work with our own individual suffering. Then we went into the second type of patience, which is the patience that kind of has some fortitude, certitude around the Dharma, continuing to do our practice in spite of the difficulties we might experience, as well as to continue to apply the teachings in our life. That does take some level of patience, some forbearance, because we are moving our mind in a totally different direction. And so in particular, in this section that we started last week, Master Shantideva is going into looking at how things arise from their respective causes and conditions. And so in that way, when we begin to understand this idea of dependent arising, that everything is arising, everything in our conditioned world arises from its respective causes and conditions, it means it doesn't have any autonomy. It doesn't have any independent status, which is essentially what the teachings on emptiness, which we'll get into in chapter 9 of Master Shantideva's text, what they're pointing to. Things lack any independent, autonomous existence. Rather, everything is interconnected. They don't stand alone apart, but rather arise on the basis of a variety of causes and conditions. In fact, infinite causes and conditions when we take things out to those degrees. So we're about to enter into a section where we're going to be looking at, because this whole idea has been brought up around things not having autonomy, we're going to get challenges from some of the Buddhist schools that existed or non-Buddhist schools, I'm sorry, that existed at the time of the Buddha, that needed to be refuted in a sense, that held positions that aren't logical within Buddhist thinking. So we'll be getting into that tonight. It does involve a little bit of head twisting stuff, but I'm going to try to make it through that without too much difficulty. We'll see what happens. So again, let me just review in terms of the outlines. We're going tonight from verse 27. In terms of the main outline that we're in, explaining the text of the chapter, we went through that first little part again that was giving us the admonishment to practice patience. And now we're in applying to the mind the methods to establish patience, which of course is the main gist of this chapter, is to get us to know the ways that we can actually cultivate patience. Within that, applying to the mind the methods to establish patience, the main section is eliminating the cause for anger. And then, of course, we have the next outline, which begins with verse 11, and it was called, let's see if I can find that in my book here, Striving to Abandon Anger upon Having Analyzed the Cause for Anger in Detail. And so within that, we had just an initial verse that encapsulated that, and then we've gone on to the second headline within that, where the little highlighted square bullet point is stopping anger for undesired actions. And of course, this is once more a fairly large section of the text where we're looking at all the techniques to stop anger. So stopping anger for undesired actions is divided into three parts. We're in the first part, stopping anger at that which faults the self, that which causes ourselves to be harmed. whether the next section we're going to look at the things that faults our friends, that endangers our friends, and so we can get angry at things that are causing our friends suffering, the people that we're close to suffering. And then we'll look at the third, which is stopping being angry at those who benefit one's enemies. These are kind of the three objects: ourselves, the people we're close to, our friends, and then the people who are benefiting our enemies, who we might get angry at. So whether we're protecting ourselves, protecting our friends, or getting angry at those that help our enemies, these are the three ways that we need to stop this mind of anger. So in terms of ourselves, the main outline here that we're still in is the tolerating the generation of suffering. And this is where we see the three types that I just went through: the patience that tolerates suffering, the patience that definitely relies on the Dharma, which is where we're at now, and the patience that does not think anything of harm, which we'll get into a little bit later tonight. So within the patience that definitely relies on the Dharma, we had a number of initial verses that we've gone through. Within this chapter, this section, there was the first part, anger, and those getting angry. Where is this? Those getting angry. I have to find these because I can't fit the whole name on the slide. Those getting angry depend on causes and hence lack independence. So this is once more that idea that when we are involved with somebody and we kind of see what's going on with them, we can begin to understand that there are causes and conditions behind why they are harming us or saying something to us that's offensive or whatever the case might be. So this is, again, the initial part that we went into already. I'm not going to review those verses. Instead, I'm going to go right into the next outline, which is in terms of Gyaltsep Je's commentary, which most of you should have, hopefully all of you have. It's page 12 of the chapter 6 commentary. And towards the bottom, it says, refuting the existence of independent causes. So refuting the existence of independent causes is going to go into three different outlines: refuting the independent self and what's called the primary principle or the fundamental principle of the enumerators, the Samkhets. These were one of these non-Buddhist schools. Then we're going to go into refuting the independent self of the Logicians, which was the translation of the Nyayikas, these Brahmanical followers of the Nyaya school of logic. These are also, again, a Hindu school that existed at the time that the Buddha is refuting, or Shantideva is refuting. Of course, the Buddha also refuted in many of his views. And then finally, the third outline, understanding all beings to resemble emanations, anger is unsuitable, kind of brings us back into that emptiness sphere and the understanding that things don't have any autonomous or independent existence. So I realize we're going to get into some tough things right at the beginning of tonight, but hopefully this will go somewhat smoothly. I do want to share before we get to that next verse that is, well, actually we do have one more outline here. Let me go ahead and put that up. Whoops, sorry. Took that off before I needed to. The next outline within this, refuting the independent refuting the independent self and the primary principle of the enumerators, the Samkhets. Within that is refuting the generation of independent expressions by that principle, and then understanding all beings. Whoops, that's the wrong one. That should be refuting that the knowledge being engages objects independently. Wow, I made a mistake there with that. Hopefully I corrected it when we come back around to that. So it's kind of interesting. In another commentary that I have, a book that's called Bodhicaryāvatāra with commentary by Sonam Tsemo, who is actually a Sakya Lama, it says, these conditions have no autonomy. Is there not some other autonomous creator? So this is kind of the question that Master Shantideva is going into, is he's using these sort of made-up protesters or opponents to come in and challenge the views that he's already set out. Again, in that first part of what we just looked at last week, it's saying everything arises on the basis of these causes and conditions. So understand that nothing has any independent status. It doesn't have any autonomy. The question is raised, though, but saying, but isn't there the possibility of an autonomous creator of all of this? So what we're going to get into in terms of these two schools, I want to read from His Holiness's book. This is page 41 of the edition I have of His Holiness's book on chapter 6, his commentary. He says, here we find a refutation of certain views held by non-Buddhist schools of Shantideva's time, particularly the views of two principal schools, the Samkhet school, which again are these numerators, and the Nyayika school, which again were called in our text the Logicians in Gyaltsab Je's commentary. The idea that is being presented here is that no things and events arise out of their own choice. Nothing enjoys an independent status. It doesn't have that ability to set itself up, to create itself. Everything arises on the basis of causes and conditions that preceded it. And those causes and conditions arise on the basis of causes and conditions that preceded them. This is how we see everything going back without any beginning, because everything has to arise from something that is of a similar nature to it, at least in terms of it being something that is caused, that is impermanent, that is changing and capable of changing into that which arises from it. What these schools are putting forward, as His Holiness is going to go into, is the idea of something that is permanent and unchanging. In this Buddhist vernacular, permanent does not mean eternal. We use that in our everyday language to think if something's permanent, that it lasts forever, even permanent marker, which really doesn't last forever, but we have that idea it's supposed to be everlasting. Well, there are some things that are permanent that are everlasting, but nonetheless, we can say that a lot of things that are permanent, they come into existence on the basis of that, what is established as that, and then they go out of existence. But while they are in existence, while that permanent phenomenon exists, it doesn't change. It's an unchanging phenomenon. So these non-Buddhist schools are adhering to something like that in terms of a creator, or something that things arise from, which in the Samkhya school is what's called the principle, or sometimes, the fundamental nature, or something. I don't really understand all the ins and outs of it, but the idea is that from that permanent phenomenon, everything arises. Well, the Buddhists would challenge that and say, how can something which is unchanging give rise to that which changes? All the variety of phenomena in the world that are impermanent, that are changing moment by moment. And then, of course, the Nyayikas, they posit a self that is permanent, which once more, if you have an unchanging self, well then how could anything involved with the self change? We change as beings. I don't think I'm the same person I was, when I was 5 years old. There's a continuity because of the continuity of awareness, but I'm not the same person. There's a change. The self changes. So again, these two ideas are in direct contrast to the Buddhist principles that Shantideva puts forward, that the Buddha himself put forward. So His Holiness continues. He says, so in order to fully argue for that nothing enjoys an independent status, one has to anticipate other rival theories, having a view or a position that there are certain types of events and things which can enjoy this independent status. Of the two examples which I have given here, the first is the Samkhet theory of Prakriti, which is a belief in some kind of primary substance or principal element. Prakriti is described as the underlying substratum from which arises the whole phenomenal world, as if this primal substance were the essence that creates the entire phenomenal world. Again, just it's a concept that the Samkhya school came up with that they feel describes the nature of existence. It doesn't make sense in Buddhist terms. The substance itself is independent, eternal, and absolute. It's an unchanging nature. Then the Nyayika school maintains that self similarly enjoys this independent, absolute, eternal sort of status. So again, these are the two ideas that are being thrown out here. And we're going to just go into the commentary, kind of leave behind that other type of, I'm not going to go into more explanation of the Samkhyas and the Nyayikas. I don't think it's relevant to what we're trying to do here. The main point that is being stressed here is that any challenges to that idea that things arise in dependence upon other factors doesn't hold water. It doesn't make sense. Okay, so let's go back to the text and jump right into verse 27 then, which is the beginning of this answer to this question. Though these conditions have no autonomy, is there not some other autonomous creator? Isn't there something else that is independent, autonomous on its own, that creates things, that is involved in things? So the first part, which again is this outline of refuting the generation of independent expressions by the principle. That which is asserted as the principle and that which is imputed as the self, these two views of the Samkhya and the Nyayika, do not arise after having purposefully thought, I shall arise. They don't have an ability to set themselves up. If they are not produced and non-existent, what is asserted to be produced at that time? In the Buddhist eyes, they're not produced, they're non-existent. So such a thing cannot exist because something that is permanent cannot give rise to something that is impermanent. It doesn't follow the law of cause and effect. So on the top of page 13, Gyaltsab Je says, consider the dual subject. Oh, I'm sorry. What I want to do is I want to skip Gyaltsab Je's commentary. I made a note on here. What I've done is I put on the slides the commentary from Abbot Dagpa Gyaltsen again, which is a commentary that one of the other students in the master's program that was with me, Ziggy Toe, that she put together. And again, I don't have that to distribute to everybody, but I nonetheless have some passages that I've inserted into the slides that you can have when those are sent out to you. So in terms of those verses I just read, the Abbot Dagpa Gyaltsen says, it follows that one, the principle who possess the five characteristics, who possesses, I think it should say, the five characteristics endowed with the three, activity, darkness, and lightness in balance. Two, the assertion, harms, and so forth gathered by the transformations of the principle are produced with self-power. And three, that which is imputed to the being of knowledge and cognition as self and imputed to be the utilizer of objects with self-power. These kinds of ideas that, again, are set out by the Samkhyas and the Nyayikas. Those are inappropriate. Why? Because the natures of the self and the principle do not arise with self-power after having purposefully thought, I shall arise for the sake of producing with self-power, with autonomy, the experience of objects and transformations. That which is unable to perform activity is similar to the horns of a rabbit. So in shorthand, what he's saying there, the horns of a rabbit is used often to describe the non-existent. Of course, in New Mexico, we have these these little postcards that have the I can't think of the name of it right now. It's the antelope, jackalope. It's kind of made up a rabbit with horns, but nonetheless, I showed that to the Tibetan teacher over in Italy, and they got kind of a kick out of it. But the horns of a rabbit means something is non-existent. So this permanent phenomenon cannot perform activity. It doesn't have the potential to produce causes for things to arise from it. What these two schools are setting out is a non-existent. It's similar to the horns of a rabbit. It simply does not exist. You can't have something that is permanent giving rise to that which is permanent, is the gist of all of this. Again, I'm just trying to go to shorthand for all of it because the words get to be a bit too much to go into. He goes on to say, it follows that at that time of producing the results, if such a result could be produced, whatever result that is asserted to be produced from the principle is inappropriate because that principle itself is unproduced. It's not impermanent. It's not caused. How can it give rise to that which is caused? There is pervasion, meaning it does hold true because that which, being unproduced itself, does not produce a result, is pervaded by being non-existent. So he's essentially saying, if you are trying to assert that something that is permanent, unchanging, gives rise to that which is impermanent and changing, you're blowing smoke. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold water. And Buddhism is much more very grounded in logic, and these two things are contrary. They counterindicate each other. Something that is unchanging doesn't act as a cause. That which is changing acts as a cause for its future result, and it is a result of its previous causes. And if we look at this body, for example, this is a caused phenomenon. The two main causes for it initially were the two cells of your parents that united in the womb of your mother. But where did those cells come from? They came from the bodies of your parents, and of course came from everything that was going on in their bodies that fed into making those cells, all the nutrition they took and everything else involved. And their bodies came from their parents in terms of the cells from their parents that united in their mother's womb and so on. You see everything being preceded by something which is changing and impermanent. You don't ever have something arising from something which is unchanging. Just simply a basic law within Buddhism. So that's the idea behind this section. And that's really what kind of gets beat into us again and again through these verses. The next one, again, it's the title is wrong on the screen. It should say, refuting that the knowledge being engages objects independently. I just didn't change that when I go through and try to do these outlines. I sometimes miss things. I apologize, but I'll change it on the slides that come to you after class. So verse 28, the last two lines, this is the middle of page 13 of Gyaltsab Je's text. It says, since it would always be distracted to its objects, it follows that it will never cease. So if you posit that there is some sort of person that exists independently, well then, if it's an unproduced phenomenon, whatever it paid its attention to, whatever that person brought to mind, it would never cease move from that because it too would be permanent and unchanging. Of course, the fact that it could bring its attention to anything would show some changing nature, but this is just a hypothetical. So if we look at what Gyaltsab Je says, he says, does the knowledge person cease when it does not engage objects? It follows it does not, because it is accepted to be a permanent functionality, which would be contrary in Buddhism. Something that functions, that is able to do things, changing in various actions and behavior, and being permanent would be contrary. And he says, and if it is that, then it will always be distracted by objects, because there will be no time when it is not apprehending objects. So if it gets distracted to a particular object, such as an object of taste or touch or whatever, it would always be distracted that object. It will never move from that, because that person, knowledge person, is a permanent phenomenon that is somehow capable still of being attentive to particular objects. Okay, so then we go on to the next outline, refuting the independent self of the logicians. This gets in a little bit more of this whole idea of the self and how the self is posited in some of these Hindu schools. This has three sub-outlines. The first one, it is impossible for something permanent to produce a result. Again, I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to hammer it home, but this is even talking about the self rather than that principle that the Samkhets posit here, the self that the Nyayikas posit, this permanent independent self. If the self were permanent, it would obviously be devoid of activity, just like space. I mean, how could something that is permanent engage in action? Something that is unchanging by its very nature wouldn't have anything that it acts upon or that it acts in relation to. It would have its own independent status. Some of these schools, again, even in the other Vedic traditions, do posit a permanent self, meaning a self that has an unchanging nature. They would call that in the Vedic traditions the Atman. Again, in the Nyayikas, I'm not sure what name they give that, but they're part of the Vedic tradition to some degree, I would think, so maybe they'd give a similar name. That sort of unchanging essence that is the self doesn't make sense in Buddhist terms, because the self is a changing phenomenon. The person is a changing phenomenon. We're not static and staying the same. They hold that there's some sort of essence to the person that is that, but that would belie its ability to interact with anything, to be involved in actions, to do whatever. So in terms of the commentary from Gyaltsab Je on this, he says towards the bottom of page 13, the Nayayika assert a self that has form and once more is a permanent functionality, which in Buddhism is contradictory. An unchanging thing which functions and changes. It just doesn't make sense. And they say it creates harm. It is something that does actually give rise to various things. It says, however, it is very clear that if such a self is a permanent functionality, then similar to non-compounded space, which is a permanent phenomenon in Buddhism, it's the mere absence of obstructive contact. That's how we define uncompounded space. It's just referring to a negation, the fact that there is a lack of obstructive contact whereby my hand can be in this particular space. It's just referring to that phenomenon of there not being any obstruction so that things can abide in certain spaces, places. So again, space is a permanent phenomenon in this context. Like uncompounded space is permanent and unchanging. So essentially what they're saying in this verse 29ab is that if the self is permanent, if the Nyayikas say that the self is permanent, then it's the same as uncompounded space in Buddhism, meaning that it can't change moment by moment, it can't act, it's a non-functioning phenomenon. It doesn't have any functionality in that regard. So this is, again, once more using Buddhist logic to refute what the other schools are saying. But Buddhist logic isn't that, it's grounded in what I would consider to be good logical process. Does it make sense that a self could be involved in activity when it is permanent and unchanging? The next section is another, it is impossible, but here it is impossible for such a self to depend on conditions. Because they would also, the Nyayikas might come back and say, well, but when it meets certain conditions, this permanent phenomenon does go through various things. Well, this also doesn't make sense in Buddhist terms. How could something which is conditioned, a causal factor, have any effect on something which is permanent and unchanging? So let's look at the commentary on that, and then I'll see. I think there's somebody putting something in the chat box. I'll get to that in a moment. It says there's an argument on the top of page 14. It's put forward there, although its nature is permanent, this is kind of coming from the Nyayika point of view, although the nature of the self is unchanging and permanent, if this self meets with conditions, then it can produce a result. Again, in Buddhist terms, this doesn't make any sense. If uncompounded space met with conditions, then it could do something? No, it's just a mere absence, an absence of contact. All things that are permanent in Buddhism, there's not that many of them. Emptiness is a permanent phenomenon, meaning it doesn't change moment by moment. How could anything which is unchanging come into contact with conditions and somehow manifest change, manifest action, manifest anything that is involved in the conditioned world? So the answer is given by Gyaltsab Je. He says it is impossible for a permanent phenomenon to meet with conditions. Although the conditions of striving and so forth meet with other conditions, how could these conditions affect the self? If the self is a permanent phenomenon that is unchanging, whatever is going on conditionally around it, even other conditions meeting with conditions or causal factors meeting with conditions, they can't affect this permanent self. The permanent self would be outside the sphere of that because it is unchanging. It has this unchanging nature, not affected by other things. So he says, it follows they cannot, these conditions cannot affect the self because the self cannot change. It follows there is a pervasion. Again, it does follow, and does make sense, because when these conditions have an effect, this self will not have changed from before the result was generated. So if they do have some sort of an effect, that's going to be an unchanging phenomenon through it. The self will not change as well by virtue of that change happening in the conditioned world. That conditioned world change will have no effect on the self because it's unchanging. I know it gets to be repetition of some of the same concepts, but this is just hammering this home that in Buddhist terms, it does not make sense that that which is unchanging, permanent, can give rise to that which is impermanent or in any way be affected by those things that are impermanent, that are caused in our world. So it says to conclude, and since it did not change, what effect did the conditions have on it? How could conditions have any effect if it's not going to change? They did not change it in the slightest. So let me see what the comment was on the, what was the description of non-compounded space? Non-compounded space is the mere absence of obstructive contact. It's the definition that's traditionally given for uncompounded space. It's referring to a negation, an absence. So we're talking about that described phenomenon, which is the absence of any obstructive contact whereby things can occupy space. But we're not talking about the physical space that they're occupying, because obviously there's an impermanent nature to there. But we're talking about the mere negation of that, which is the lack of any obstructive contact. Generally, any of these permanent phenomena are absences, they're negations, because a negation, by its very nature, continues until it goes out of existence. So again, I'm not going to get into the whole thing around emptiness, but we did allude to emptiness earlier, because this whole section is about hammering home the Buddhist concept of emptiness through understanding interdependence, through understanding how everything that is conditioned doesn't have an ability to stand on its own. Therefore, it is empty of independent status. So if we look at emptiness, if I talked about the emptiness of this bowl, we mean the quality of it lacking any inherent existence. In other words, the negation of inherent existence or independent existence with regard to this bowl. Well, that emptiness of it lasts for the duration of the bowl. It comes into existence when the bowl comes into existence, and it goes out of existence when the bowl ceases to exist. But through that time, from when it starts and when it ends, it doesn't change in the least. It's a negation of inherent or intrinsic or independent existence in relation to the bowl. The bowl and its emptiness arise at the same time and continue through the existence and fall away at the same time. When the bowl ceases to exist, its emptiness ceases to exist. But while the bowl is changing moment by moment, the emptiness of the bowl never changes. An example for non-physical phenomena. Oh boy, like the mind? I don't know what you mean, the mind, Andrea? Are you?
I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself and ask because I always see, and maybe it's not an appropriate question, but it's always like about a physical phenomenon, which is very
Yeah,
easy to understand.
sure.
Like a house is made of wood, which
Yeah,
comes
yeah.
from a tree. But
Okay.
like maybe a thought or maybe ego, is that something that we can
Sure.
talk about?
And again, I don't want to go too deeply into that because we're getting kind of a little bit off track with that. But
Okay.
nonetheless, all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. Even emptiness is empty of inherent existence. So even, this permanent phenomenon, this negation is empty of inherent existence. But what we mean by that is it doesn't set itself up. It depends on other factors. So in the end, we talk about dependent arising in terms of causes and conditions, that give rise to this bowl. We also can talk about it in terms of parts, that it depends upon its parts. But finally, in the end, it depends upon us designating it as bowl. But that's the same with regard to any phenomenon. If I talk about thought, the thought of going to the store, the thought of going to the store arises on the basis of its causes and conditions. It doesn't have any autonomous entity. It also has its parts, the part of when that is initially formulating, the thought of when it's in the middle of it, and the thought of when it ends, when I actually go to the store and no longer have to have the thought of going to the store because I'm already at the store. And then we can also say it arises merely by designation because that's what I'm calling it. That's how I am imputing it. I'm calling it the thought, I'm going to go to the store. So thoughts exist this way, uncompounded space exists this way, emptiness exists this way. All phenomena that are conditioned and not conditioned exist lacking any inherent existence, lacking any independent status. So that may be enough for now. Let's see if there's room at the end for questions, because I do want to keep moving on this so that we can get through this section and kind of thought wouldn't exist without the brain. Well, let's not bring the brain into it. Let's bring mind into it. Mind imputes, not brain. I mean, our brain functions in tandem with the mind. That's all right, Marie. No worries. Yeah, but when we don't equate the two in Buddhism. The brain is the physical matter that is in our skull, and the mind is a non-physical phenomenon that is arising in conjunction with all this, and it has its own kind of status, and it goes on beyond this life, and it came from prior to this life. It's a mental energy, if you will, that is arising in tantric teachings. They say there's a very subtle wind that goes with this mind that is what allows it to move moment by moment. But nonetheless, it doesn't have a physical quality in and of itself. So yes, absolutely, the mind is involved in this. The mind is imputing things. That's the subtlest way that everything exists. It's called the subtlest level of dependent arising, that in the end, emptiness, any phenomenon, exists through mere designation, mere imputation, meaning a conceptual mind putting a label on something, which generally involves language, but it doesn't always involve language. Okay, let's go back into this. Again, I know some of you are still new to some of these Buddhist concepts, so I'm apologizing for kind of moving more quickly through them. But this chapter, once more, is primarily about patience. And the idea in this section is, yes, to bring to mind some of our awareness of these deeper teachings as we practice patience. But even just to get it at the dependent arising level, to get that things are arising on the basis of various causes and conditions. This should already begin to lessen some of our anger at things, because we begin to see how everything's involved in causality. Why do beings do particular things to us? We're going to get into this in the third type of patience tonight, when we start talking about why are beings, treating us in particular ways. Well, it's all arising through causes and conditions. Things don't have any autonomous entity, any ability to stand on their own. So whether we talk about the people or whether we talk about their actions or their thoughts or whatever. So So we are going to go on then to this middle section, which once more was, maybe I even commented on that already. I think I did. So even if it were to meet with other conditions, what could the unchanging do? You know, if it were to meet with things that were changing, that which is unchanging couldn't be affected by that. Even if when acted upon, it remains as before, what did the activity do to it? You know, how could activity have some effect on that which stays the same, which is unchanging? I mean, again, just to get it at that level is not as important as maybe to get all the other underlying concepts around emptiness. Really just to understand it, if we say something is unchanging, such as the person, the self, or, you know, this principle that everything's rising from, how can it interact with things in terms of being affected by them, causing other things, what have you, because it itself never changes as long as it exists. So let's go on then to the final outline that's on, again, page 14 of Gyaltsab Je's commentary. It says, such a self cannot be related to conditions. So these last two lines of that section says, if it is said, this is the activity of that, how could the two ever be related? How can you have a relation between two things in terms of causal relationship or even a natural relationship, you know, being of the same nature, if things are of a different nature when it comes down to it, if one thing is unchanging and the other is changing? So let me read what Gyaltsab Je says here. It's not very long, but an argument is put forward. It says, the self does not facilitate an action that is in its own nature, as this action is an entity different from the self. If you have a permanent self, an unchanging self, how can it initiate an action that is changing, and that, you know, action by its very nature means something which changes? Something which begins, goes into a middle, and then ends. This is what happens with any action we do, right? The action of eating a meal, the action of, you know, going to sleep. I mean, you have a beginning to it, a middle to it, and an end to it. This is how these things arise. Any action that we engage in has that quality. It changes. So how can that have any relationship to a self that is unchanging? The answer is given. This is also not valid. Because if one says that the action which creates the result of this self is of a different entity, then how does it become related to the self? If you are somehow going to say, well, but yeah, that's the unchanging part of it, that unchanging action, but I'm sorry, the changing part of it, the changing action, but you have the unchanging self. Well, then how can you have a relationship between those two things? Again, the two types of relationships, it's explained here in the middle of page 14. It could not be related to the self by nature or cause. If something is related to something, it's the same in terms of its nature, or it's related causally. It's the result of that, or it's the cause that led to that. It can have some sort of relationship to something, but it's only within those two ideas. You can't have a relationship between something which is permanent and unchanging with something that is changing and impermanent. It just doesn't make sense in Buddhist terms. And I would say, again, it doesn't make sense in logical terms as well. So let's go back, and we can only have a little bit more to make it through this. And again, we're getting into the part where we're actually going to look at how does this help us to refute our anger, to actually, you know, move in the direction of things actually, you know, having a beneficial impact on us. So I'm sorry, that previous said understanding all beings to resemble emanations, anger is unsuitable. So this is kind of getting it back into the emptiness thing and the realization that if things don't have an autonomous, independent entity, then everything is dependent upon causes and conditions in our conditioned world. Again, there are some phenomena that don't, that are permanent, but they are separate from all that world of causes and conditions. They don't depend upon it in the same way. So when we look at the conditioned world, it doesn't make sense that things would be able to arise autonomously. So let's look at the verse in regard to this. Hence, all are governed by others. And through the power of that, they have no power, no self-power. They're other-powered. Other things give rise to various results. Then that result becomes a part of giving rise to some other result. Having understood in this way, I shall not become angry at all these things that are like emanations. emanations, mirages, all these various things that the Buddha used, was the idea that things appear to be kind of solid and independent. This is part of the fault that we are also dealing with in terms of having had this ignorance for so long. Things do seem like this bowl to have some sort of autonomous entity. It seems to have its bowlness established out here on what I'm holding in my hand. But it's like an emanation. It's like a hallucination, an illusion. It appears to be that way, but it doesn't. This bowl arose on the basis of myriad causes and conditions. The primary cause, of course, the substantial cause, was the brass, the metal that it was melded from. But then you have all the other things that are involved in producing it, right? People that worked in the factory where this was made, that made sure it came out rounded in the right places and not too thin in other places, and then of course everybody who mined the metal that it was made from, who was involved in producing the meals for the people who work on the bowls. I mean, you have all these other causes and conditions that are a network of things involved in this bowl. It doesn't have any independent status. It doesn't exist on its own, autonomously. Now, again, bowls are not what we're talking about. We're talking about when we are experiencing anger towards some other being or some situation. Those situations are arising from their causes and conditions. So this is kind of a point we're going to be following up on when we get to the third type of patience, when we start working with the harm that others inflict upon us. We begin to see that they're not doing that autonomously. They're doing that because they're affected by myriad causes and conditions that cause them to do those things and say those things. So things don't have any independent status. This is something we saw again previously in terms of the beginning of this second type of patience. And now we're getting into sort of a refutation that anything could be arising autonomously, which once more brings to mind our understanding of dependent arising, our understanding of emptiness, that things don't have the ability to set themselves up. All right. Again, as I'm going through this, feel free to throw questions into the chat box. I may not deal with them immediately, but it's good if you do have a question to put it there, especially if you're new and have something you'd like to ask. I'll try to address all of those when we get to the end of today's class. But I'd like to lecture for about another half hour and see how far we can get, because some of the verses coming up are not quite as complicated in my estimation as what we're dealing with here. So then we get into the next section. So we're in the third section of this, where we're looking at the extensive explanation on this second type of patience, the patience that definitely relies on the Dharma, that uses an understanding of emptiness and dependent arising and so on to undermine here, our thoughts of anger that could arise. This is talking about the need for reversing anger. We just have one verse for this, verse 32. So somebody's putting forward again an opinion that says, what will counteract it? Counteraction would also be inappropriate. This opinion is coming from someone who's misunderstanding what has just been said about things not having their own autonomous identity. They mistake that for them not existing at all, because in their eyes, if it doesn't have its own independent identity, it couldn't exist. This is, again, the lower schools of Buddhism that are putting forward this type of an argument, because they all hold to independent or inherent existence. This is the unique view of the consequence middle way school, the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, which is said to be the final word that the Buddha gave in terms of the wisdom that realizes emptiness or selflessness. So the response that's given by somebody who challenges that and says, in the face of things lacking any autonomous entity, well, then they have to not exist. So what would be counteracting it? What would it be that would be counteracted? It doesn't make sense in their view. The response from this higher school, the consequence middle way school, is in dependence upon it, the continuity of suffering will be severed. It is not inappropriate. In other words, in dependence upon this knowledge, this wisdom that knows that we are, seeing things as they correctly are, understanding things in terms of that emptiness, that will actually get us, where we want to go, where we want to be. So I've done the same thing here. I liked Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen's commentary a little bit better than what we have in Gyaltsep J's, so I'm going to put that forward on the screen. This is a commentary on that opinion from these lower schools, these lower Buddhist schools. If there is not even an atom of inherent establishment, if things can't be established independently, autonomously, what antidote will counteract the object of abandonment? Since action and agent are not feasible in their view, counteraction would also be inappropriate. Once more, this is the lower school saying that they can't make sense out of the Prasangika Madhyamaka point of view. That if you say that things don't exist from their own side, don't have an ability to establish themselves, don't exist independently, then they can't exist at all because everything exists that way in their view. They haven't gotten the subtle object of negation that the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school, is getting at. They haven't gotten to that fine understanding of what emptiness really means. Which, again, we're not saying that there's no bowl. What we're saying is that the phenomenon that we call bowl is just called that. That's the only way it exists. It is a label that I'm giving to this stuff in my hand. What's in my hand isn't a real bowl. It's merely imputed as a bowl. And that's good enough. Things still function. Things still arise in dependence upon that designation. It has no bowlness, no bowl identity from the side of what I'm holding in my hand. It can't establish itself as bowl. And this is true with regard to trees. This is true with regard to air. This is true with regard to people. This is true with regard to everything that exists. Everything depends upon if it's caused, its causes and conditions, whether it's caused or not, upon its parts, and then thirdly, in the most subtle way, dependent upon that designation, that imputation by a conceptual mind. The conceptual mind designates things and brings them into existence. We can say that there was no tree before some being conceptualized what a tree was. And from the side of that phenomenon that was eventually to be called tree, there's no treeness, because treeness is the concept that we use to relate to that. And of course, we can see that that's true because look at a woodpecker. A woodpecker doesn't see a tree in the way that we see a tree. We might see a tree as something to have nice shade in the summer, so that we could sit underneath it in the hot sun and still be cool, or that adorns our yard and produces a beautiful, landscape for us. But that's not how a woodpecker sees a tree. A woodpecker sees a tree as a home. It can go in and make its little hole in its home and can live in there. A termite would see a tree very differently, right? It's like a cafeteria. It's lunchtime for the termite. So every being is having a different experience of the tree on the basis of its own designation to that. There's nothing that is tree from the side of that basis. Tree is a concept that we give it, how we relate to it, how we, see its functioning and its use in the world around us. Other beings would see it very, very differently. So there's no real tree from the side of that basis. Tree, once more, is merely imputed. So this opinion that's being set forward is by people who can't handle that concept. They think if something doesn't exist from its own side, if it doesn't have its own identity as tree, established from its own side, it can't exist at all. I think it has to have its sort of intrinsic essence, its intrinsic nature, or else it can't be identified as that. No, things do have their nature. The nature of this in my hand is very different from a tree outside, but it doesn't have it intrinsically. It's not here inherently. And again, it's a long time to get to this in terms of Buddhist teachings. This is where we have to repeatedly go back to emptiness teachings to eventually fine-tune our understanding so that we can get it, so that we can really understand what's being negated and what is still being upheld. Things do exist. The Buddha never said things don't exist. But the Buddha said things don't exist the way you think they exist. And this is the subtle point that's being gotten at here. So all the lower Buddhist schools would take issue with this point of view. That's the opinion that's being set forward. The response from this higher point of view is the antidote and the object of abandonment, the wrong conception, apprehending the two truths as contradictory, that does not know how to posit action and agent in objects that are empty of inherent existence. In other words, any misconceptions that are objects of abandonment, even our own inability to apprehend the complementary nature of these ideas of emptiness and dependent arising and so on. Everything is empty of inherent establishment. The antidote itself, the object that we're abandoning, everything is empty. And he goes on to say, it follows that this is not inappropriate then, because it is asserted that in dependence upon the realization that the object of abandonment and the antidote are empty of inherent establishment. In other words, depending upon realizing emptiness, all afflictions such as anger will be extinguished. This is the final antidote to our anger, to our ignorance, to our attachment, to the karma that arises on the basis of those, to our suffering. Everything is built on a misunderstanding about how things exist. Realizing emptiness is very effective because it helps you to undermine the whole process. So they're counteracting these lower Buddhist schools and simply saying, no, you're wrong. It's very effective. If you realize the lack of inherent existence of these things, everything that is a product of that ignorance will be extinguished. Our anger will be gone and so on. Then it says finally, and due to that extinguishment, the continuity of suffering will be severed. Of course, this is the most fundamental thing that the Buddha is telling us, is that if we don't remove that ignorance through the wisdom realizing emptiness, we will never be free of our suffering. We will continue to experience the three sufferings I mentioned in the motivation tonight, of the suffering that's the more pain, the evident suffering, the suffering of change, and especially the pervasive compounded suffering. You're going to continue to be under the sway of all of that until you realize emptiness, which immediately cuts the root of our being in cyclic existence, our being in samsara. So it's very effective according to the Prasangika Madhyamaka. The lower schools might think that this is a nihilistic point of view, that by saying that you're denying that things exist. But this is simply not true. So we finally arrive to the summary that is the conclusion to this second type of patience. Phew, what a long way going. Okay, so we have two verses for this. Verse 33 says, so when seeing an enemy or even a friend doing something incorrect, by thinking it arises from such conditions, I shall remain in a happy frame of mind. When we see the conditionality of things, it should be an application of some wisdom that helps to undermine our concretizing things, our thinking that that person is inherently evil, inherently wrong, inherently whatever. And then he goes on to say, if things were established with one's freedom, then since no one wishes to suffer, suffering would not occur to any embodied creature. If all it took was a simple wish to not suffer, then no one would be suffering, right? Instead, suffering and all of what we see in the world around us, all the things that people do to us that cause us to suffer, they arise from respective causes and conditions. They are dependent arisings. They don't have any independent autonomous existence. So our thought to not suffer isn't sufficient because we have this whole network of causality that's going on, that things are arising in the midst of. Yeah. So let me look at what Gyaltsep Jay says on this, and this will conclude this section. Hopefully we can put this to rest, but it says in the middle of page 15, for those reasons, if one sees someone, whether it is a friend or an enemy, doing something unsuitable that harms, meaning harms you in particular, think, this person has only become like this due to their afflictions. They do not have any freedom. This is why we often talk about sentient beings being under the control of their karma and their delusions. These beings are doing these things because they don't really, I don't want to say they'd have absolutely no choice, because obviously we're practicing Buddhism because we want to embrace the concept that we have a choice, that we can choose to move in the direction of wisdom and compassion and so on, rather than in the direction of delusion and affliction and everything that is being described here. But nonetheless, most beings are under the control of those factors because they don't even have the tools to be able to undermine those factors, to get rid of them, as was just explained in the previous verse, that you can do. It's very appropriate and extremely effective. If you apply the antidote completely and properly, you can be free of all of your suffering. So he goes on then to say, keeping this in mind, stop anger and make your mental happiness firm by not letting it degenerate. Be patient in such a way. So once more, this second type of patience is about using the various teachings of the Buddha through our certitude in them, our understanding of them, our ability to comprehend them and use them to make sure that we do facilitate our diminishment of the delusions by virtue of that. If I think that the only reason why this person's saying these things to me and doing these things to me is because they're under the control of all these other factors, well, then it gets rid of that view of this kind of autonomous, independent person that's out there acting towards me in that particular way. Rather, what they are doing is a product of everything that has preceded that, that has fed into that. that once more, they're under the control of. They don't have any independent ability to, kind of just on the basis of their thoughts, just to say, I don't want to suffer, I don't want to create suffering. That's not enough. You're still going to be under the sway of all those causal factors until you remove them through the wisdom realizing emptiness. Then the commentary continues with the commentary on verse 34. It says, if the result would be independently created out of their own wish, as I was just saying, if they've simply the wish to not suffer, without the power of other conditions, if you could do that and have no other conditions have any effect at all, I'm not going to suffer, I'm not going to cause suffering to anyone else. We obviously can't just make that assertion and have it come to pass, because the causes and conditions are still there for us to suffer, for us to cause harm to others, and so on. So it says, then, since not one sentient being desires suffering, none of all the embodied beings should have any suffering. If the mere thought alone to not suffer or to not cause suffering to others was sufficient, then no one would suffer. We'd never see any suffering going on in the world. Obviously, it's not enough, because everything's arising in this network of causes and conditions. Things are dependent arisings and therefore don't have any autonomous status. So, concluding this, since we see that they receive suffering and they do not have freedom, they're under the control of these factors, it is unsuitable to be angry at them. The mental afflictions are behind them. Once more, we do see that this is true to some extent. We might not get angry at somebody who's, for example, under the control of some medicine. Say you knew somebody and they were taking a medicine that made them very irritable. Because of the psychological effects of the medicine they're taking, they get angry really easily. Well, you'd have some patience with them, right? Because you see they're under the control of this medicine. Well, what the Shantideva is saying here is all beings are under the control of their karma and their delusions, the past causes and conditions that have fed into the present that cause them to do and say things that are contrary to what their deepest wish is. They don't want to suffer. They don't want to cause suffering for others, but they still do those. Why? Because all the causes and conditions influence them to continue to do that. All right, so this is this section. Let me see. Based on the argument of permanent, impermanent, how come then the realization of emptiness, permanent, has an effect on the impermanent mind? The realization of emptiness is not permanent. Emptiness is permanent. So you can realize a permanent phenomenon because you can realize all phenomena. Whether it's permanent or impermanent, it can be an object of our mind. We can come to know it. Just like when I'm talking about emptiness, I'm giving you some idea of what emptiness is. You can bring that to mind, and that's an unchanging, permanent phenomenon. But the realization of it in your mind is a impermanent phenomenon. So therefore, we can change our mind with the realization. The object itself isn't what's changing our mind, it's the realization of the object. Because emptiness has always been there. Emptiness is a phenomenon that we're not newly making up. It's been there since beginningless time. It's our realization of emptiness that is the causal factor that removes the obstructions and eventually causes us to attain liberation or enlightenment. Yeah, Fernando, I think you had your hand up. Let's go ahead and take a question now. I've kind of already taken the whole session pretty much to go through this section, which wasn't my plan, but nonetheless. Go ahead, Fernando.
So I have a comment in relation to the two main schools of the Mahayana tradition in relation to emptiness, which are both the Madhyamika and the Cheetah Mantra, and then a question in relation to that. So whenever you realize emptiness, you also get closer, or maybe at the same time do realize the ultimate bodhicitta, that everything gets interconnected, and then in that way, you want to help everyone else. Nonetheless, in the Cheetah Mantra school, which for what I know, it appears after the Madhyamika one, and which might be a little different, I guess. And then I do not understand completely that Cheetah Mantra section because it is not usually explained in Tibetan Buddhism. But then again, it's like the only mind school, right? So then if in Cheetah Mantra they explain that it's the mind that exists and then everything is related to it and then it interacts in that way, would it mean that the interaction or the interconnectedness, it only depends on the mind of each sentient beings and not in relation with the other things? I don't know how
to I know this, and this is getting us way into a whole nother end of the pool, in the deep end. But Cheetah Mantra, again, is one of the other, as you said, Mahayana schools of thought. Compared to Madhyamika, the middle way, this is a mind-only Cheetah Mantra. And again, it's a bit of a complex system to explain, so I'm really reluctant to get into it tonight because I think it does take us quite a bit off track. It is said to be a stepping stone to some degree in terms of it begins to question the substantial nature of things that are external to the mind. But it doesn't hit the nail quite on the head in terms of what the middle way school is saying, and it does have some faults from the perspective of the middle way school. So I would prefer to really, I know that chapter 9 is quite a ways in the future, but I really have to kind of set it aside at this juncture because I'm afraid it's going to take us too long to get into a full explanation of what mind only does. And maybe I can send you separately, some links to a few things that might be good for you to look into, or I can do that to everyone if I can find something by tomorrow that will be a concise way of explaining the mind-only school, because it is very different and it does still involve some interrelation kind of concepts, but it is, a very different view. According to the middle way school, what mind-only is positing isn't really accurate. And even some people in the traditional teachings question what's the point of kind of understanding the mind-only school and really starting to work with their view of emptiness when you're going to refute it in the end, when you're not going to say it even is correct. They would say it's like rolling around in mud before you take a bath. So I don't know. It's a very strange school. Yeah, Andrea.
So I've been thinking a lot about it. Intellectually, I understand what you're saying, or I grasp. Understand is a big statement. But like when we think in terms of what's going on today, and you see like politics, people making bad decisions about COVID, in which people who are, in a hospital don't get the care that they need, and you get angry, right? Is the thought process like, I struggle with the idea of just telling myself, okay, the system is set up this way, it's collective karma, it's that person's karma, therefore I have to accept that they're going through their own karma. And do you know what I mean? Like, how do you place yourself in the world where you see injustices and you get aggravated? You feel like, what do you do?
Sure. And again, what we're mostly trying to do is once more undermine the delusion of anger. The delusion of anger is not going to serve any purpose. Remember at the very beginning of this course, I talked about how His Holiness in his book talks about how we can find some forms of what we might call a justifiable anger, which is not really the delusion of anger. It is a compassionate motivation to address the suffering in the world and the injustices that occur that is motivated by compassion for everyone involved. We don't want people to be making bad decisions that affect others detrimentally because that's not good for them to do, but we also don't want people to suffer from those bad decisions. How are we most effectively going to address those things in the world? Not with the mind that's deluded and angry and upset and blaming the other person and calling them an idiot and not taking into consideration everything that we're talking about, which is people are making decisions and saying the things they do on the basis of causes and conditions that preceded it. So if we have that understanding, we can diminish the mind of anger towards those people and still be dedicated to changing their behavior and to changing things in the world from a vantage point of compassion. And I don't think, again, that the Mahayana tradition definitely embraces the whole concept of us being active agents in the world to help affect change. But we have to do that with the right mindset. Does that make sense?
Yeah. On his movie, he talks about it. I think there's a point when he says about the Chinese, right? Like he doesn't hate them, even though he doesn't agree with what happened. There's a profound sentence, I'm going to try to find it, in which he says, I disagree. I don't hate, but I disagree, kind of thing, right?
Exactly. And I think that's what we have to delineate is he makes a big distinction. And of course, this whole teaching on anger and patience in this chapter is to get us to distinguish between the person and the states of mind that they have. This is what we're going into in this next section, which hopefully we can dig into soon, because it gets into that point of view of the person is being wielded then by their anger. Their anger is for the real enemy.
Ignorance or whatever.
Their ignorance or their attachment or whatever it is, whatever delusion is going on that's causing them to do those things to us or to others that causes them harm. they're not under the complete autonomous control of that's being influenced by those patterns. So when we have that understanding, we've got at least an ability to work with it that is very different from the mind of anger that pigeonholes them into evil person doing evil things and awful and da-da-da-da. And then they become the object of our scorn, and we start tweeting about them and posting things about them because we want everybody to hate them. That's not the way to resolve things in the world. It's not to say yeah, this is what we like to do, right? Because it feeds those delusions that we bought into them for so long, and we think that they're completely justifiable. This next section is where we get into this, and we really understand that when beings are harming us, we have to have a bigger perspective. We have to know what exactly is going on here, so that we then have the room to diminish our anger and see them in a different light.
Makes sense. Okay,
and it still means you can oppose their actions. Absolutely. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, so are we ready to move on? Or is there something more? Lynn. Yeah. Hi, Lynn.
Hi. Thank you for the teaching.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I guess maybe this is, I'm just trying to distill it down.
Mm-hmm.
All of what you were saying. So this, if we look at the causes and conditions, and we're obviously like developing compassion and empathy, recognizing these different states of consciousness, including our own consciousness in terms of causes and conditions and karma, then and of course emptiness as well, that there isn't anything that intrinsically exists in and of itself. This all, working with all of this helps us to develop patience, because we become more aware of different states of consciousness, how it arises, and recognizing that there isn't anything that inherently exists, so that there isn't any, the anger isn't there isn't any object subject. It just sort of, it's part of what emerges within causes and conditions, but it's all empty of inherent existence. So when we when situations arise, if we can perceive situations and walk it through that process, that will help us to develop more compassion.
Sure.
As well as recognize, as well as give us patience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, a comparable thing, again, one of the most common analogies that the Buddha used to talk about how we can gain an appreciation for emptiness is a dream. And I like to use this because it's very effective for my mind, and I hope it's effective for others. But when you're in a dream, you can have lots of emotions arising, right? Because you're investing your dream in a level of reality that is contrary to how it actually exists. So when we are dreaming and there's objects of desire, or there's objects of fear or anger or whatever the case coming into our dream experience, we can have real emotions arising on the basis of that. And we can even wake up in a sweat from having some fearful dream, a nightmare where we've been chased all over by some horrific thing. And then when we wake up, we go, oh, that wasn't real. It didn't have the reality that I was investing in it.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the understanding of emptiness is similar. I'm not saying everything is like a dream, but there is that quality to it, that it appears to have some substantial nature. We appear to have some substantial nature. We're clinging to that whole concept, and we end up in this concretizing of that whole experience and having a whole emotional array of stuff that arises on the basis of that is totally ungrounded, because things don't exist that way at all. Just like in our dream, things are not real in the way that they appear.
Right, so that's where the anger comes in.
Right. That's where we're just having these emotions on the basis of investing in a level of reality that is not in accord with how things actually are. If we have the understanding of how reality is, just like if you had lucid dreaming, if you were a lucid dreamer and you could go into your dreams and go, oh wow, there's a dream lion that's chasing me. I don't need to be afraid of it because it's just a dream lion. would really change your whole experience of your dreams. I'm not a lucid dreamer myself, so I can't speak to it, but it's a similar concept. If we were able to see things for what they are, we would stop investing things with such concrete reality, and the emotions that are based on that process of investing in that wouldn't arise.
No, that's really.
We'd be patient. Patience is kind of our natural state in that sphere of emptiness, just like compassion is our natural state. What Fernando was pointing out in terms of the Mahayana thinking that we want to connect with the suffering of all others. But when we're in that sphere of emptiness, the heart's wide open. Then there's nothing blocking it from connecting with others and so on.
Yeah.
So
it's taking down that negative, the negativity.
All of those delusions, because everything is rooted in ignorance. If we get rid of that ignorance and block that mistaken thought from arising, none of it can arise. It doesn't have any ground at all, any basis.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's do just a little bit more text if we can, because I really would like to make it a little bit further, at least introduce and start getting into this next section. I don't know, did I read the commentary? I think I did. Yeah, so we are on now page 17 of the Gyaltsep. There was another little page that had had these different outlines, and we are entering into, let me go ahead and put on this previous one with the outline, the third of the 3 types of patience. Again, this is within the outline that's called Tolerating the Generation of Suffering. And it's these verses from 12 through 51. We're in the third part of this, which is the third type of patience, the patience that does not think anything of harm. By here, we're mostly focusing on physical harm in this section. When someone is harming you physically, obviously we get harmed mentally, we get harmed, through other speech and what have you. We're going to look at some of those later. But this section mostly focuses on when you are physically harmed by others. So in terms of this, this is on the handout that you all have for this course for Extinguishing the Flames of Anger. It's a PDF file that you should have. It says, this form of patience could also be considered to be the patience of not retaliating, or the patience of being compassionate to enemies. It is the capacity to tolerate harm from others without angrily striking back. Again, I would, although Shantideva emphasizes physical things here, it doesn't mean that this also doesn't include being verbally accosted or having other people do things that upset your mind and what have you. So His Holiness in the book, The Path to Bliss, he says the patience of being indifferent to harm inflicted by others is especially important for practitioners of the Mahayana. Why? Because Mahayana doctrine in particular, and Buddha's doctrine in general, are rooted in compassion. Therefore, you should be able to forbear and endure the harm inflicted by others. Of course, this is one of the most challenging things. When we look at the first type of patience, just in terms of the general sufferings of samsara, it's one thing to be patient with the aging of the body or with an illness. It's another thing to be patient with a person who's in your face or who's, doing things that are really antagonistic to you. So this is divided in turn into 3 parts. The first part is bringing to mind the method for compassion. And let's go into this a little bit. Maybe we can get into a few of the verses of this before we conclude. This has 3 subsections within it. And the first subsection is some harm themselves out of ignorance. That we see that even sentient beings are harming themselves out of ignorance. Well, why are we so shocked when they harm us out of ignorance? So verse 35 says, through lacking conscientiousness, people even harm themselves with thorns and other things, and for the sake of obtaining partners and the like, they become obsessed and starve themselves. Again, Master Shantideva says women because he's teaching to an audience of monks. But for the sake of obtaining a partner or of various other things we might want to achieve, we do a lot we can. That beings can do a lot of harm to themselves, become obsessed and even starve themselves. And there are some who harm themselves by hanging themselves, leaping from cliffs, eating poison and incompatible food, and unmeritorious deeds. I mean, again, maybe we don't see this that widely in our world, but nonetheless, at the time of Master Shantideva writing, there were many people who engaged in a lot of very ascetic and difficult practices with the idea that that would bring about some level of moksha or liberation. There even continue to be some of these traditions in India where people do a lot of self torture and things that would try to inflict harm on the body with the sense that that would somehow purify all the karma of it and they'd achieve moksha, achieve liberation. So beings are capable of harming themselves. Certainly when we look at the world of substance abuse and addiction and what have you, people harm themselves greatly for the sake of what they get from those substances that they partake of. So Gyaltsab-je, in his commentary at the middle of page 17, says, these people that harm others through the power of recklessness and afflictions also harm themselves. So if someone's harming you, don't think that they're incapable of harming themselves. They probably also harm themselves in various ways, or even in karmically they're harming themselves. We all do. To attain liberation, they roll on thorns or jump from great heights. Some become obsessed with attaining wealth and women, and out of anger starve themselves and so forth. Some are obstructed by the afflictions and jump from great heights, eat poison and other disagreeable things. Through non-meritorious negative actions that are the cause for the lower realms, they harm themselves in this and future lives. And to some degree, all beings are harming themselves in that capacity. Most beings are ignorant of the law of cause and effect of karma and continue to do things that propel them into another rebirth of suffering, a lower rebirth. So the question arises at the end of this, how can it be appropriate to be angry when one is harmed by others who also harm themselves? They don't have the capacity to refrain from causing harm to themselves. What makes you think they're going to have the capacity to refrain from harming you? And it just makes sense again in terms of this logic that is being put forward here. Master Shantideva is going to give us a lot of reasoning, a way of looking at things that can help us to not be angry at that time. The next verse, it says, if they commit suicide due to ignorance, it is no great surprise that they harm others. If beings even kill themselves out of their delusion, take their own lives, which is a sad thing in our world, very sad to see when that happens. And some of you no doubt have had people in your life who have done that. But the understanding here is that if they even will inflict that level of harm on themselves, once more, is it so shocking that they harm others? If, when under the influence of afflictions, people will even kill their treasured selves, how can they not cause harm to the bodies of others? So Gyaltsab-je says, when one falls under the control of the afflictions, one will suffer at heart and be despondent and even kill oneself. At this time, how could it come that one does not harm the body of other sentient beings? By thinking that it is impossible not to be harmed, it is unsuitable to get angry. Again, we're not trying to give everyone a pass. This isn't what this is about. And saying, oh, because all these beings will harm themselves and they'll even kill themselves, they get a rain check. I don't have to worry about it. It's to give you the space to be able to not be so bent out of shape when individuals harm you. Why? Because they rarely have the capacity to refrain from harming themselves. So why should it be so shocking in those times when they do, lash out at us or at others that we might get angry at? Here we're mostly looking at ourselves, right? Because this whole section's about harm that's inflicted on us, the faults that we have to experience. So let's see if we can get through this last little bit and then we'll probably conclude for tonight. It is suitable to be compassionate instead. Again, this is bringing to mind the method for compassion. If we understand this about those beings and how much they're under the control of those types of thoughts and can barely refrain from harming themselves, much less harming others, well, they're objects of compassion for us. Even if I virtually cannot develop compassion for such people, even if I can't go to that degree to have compassion, who through the arisal of affliction set out to kill me and so forth, who intend to harm me, the last thing I should do is to become angry with them. Why? Because it's unjustifiable in the face of that. They're under the control of their own delusions. So here, Gyaltsab-je, the top of page 18, he says, it is suitable to practice compassion towards such a person that, upon having generated afflictions, harms others, as explained above, and even kills themselves. Even if compassion is not generated, then how can anger be the final word? How can it be the appropriate thing to do? It is extremely unsuitable to get angry. So again, this is, of course, within the Mahayana tradition, but also I think all Buddhist traditions, and I would say even most spiritual traditions would say, in the end, how can it really be right to get angry and upset at somebody who through the force of a variety of things has, come to a place where they've done something that has harmed you? or harm those that you love, even if we go outside of the sphere of just individual harm, we really get that there's something else going on here. Previously, again, in that prior section, we were looking at the fact that all of that's arising through causes and conditions. But even if we look at just the state of mind of beings every day, they're rarely capable of being totally in charge of not causing themselves harm, at least karmically. So why do we expect them to be so good about not harming others? We're like laying a trip on beings that they're not capable of living up to. That's our expectation of them. We expect everybody in the world is going to be good at treating others kind, and they don't even treat themselves kind. So that's an unrealistic expectation. Our angry response is not justified. So I don't know if there were any other questions in the chat box. I don't think so. Maybe we don't have time for much more. We'll be kind of figuring out what we need to do. I was hoping to get all the way up to about 51 tonight, and we're falling a little bit behind because I was hoping, again, we've got 4 more classes scheduled. Next Monday, we didn't have a class scheduled. We'll be in touch with the people who've registered to make sure that you all know, what's going on in terms of the schedule. But we got to figure something out because I am dealing with plans in September. I'm going on retreat and what have you, so it becomes harder to add more classes to it. Another option we might look at is making these classes just a tad longer, just a half hour. And that might be a way to make sure we get through a little bit more. But I don't want to add another half hour and then end up, I love the questions and I love answering the questions, but nonetheless, we might have to limit those to some degree. There is the idea of having class next week. And is there anybody, let me just get a show of hands. Is there anybody, I know some of you don't have your cameras on, but maybe you can put something in the chat box. Anybody who it would be problematic if we held class next week, you couldn't attend and it would be problematic for you? Anyone? I'm happy to add another class on, and maybe that's one way to kind of work with it, and so next week is fine, okay. So again, the topic for what we'll be continuing with next week is this chapter 6 of Master Shantideva. Extinguishing the flames of anger is all the course is kind of going through all of this. So we will just continue going through verse by verse. And again, if you haven't registered, I'm not sure, Marie, you're putting in the box some questions that I'm not sure, then maybe contact the Shantideva Center in New York or Namdro Ling Center in Miami, and they will make sure that they get you registered and get you the materials for this, because there's like the verses and the commentary and all of that, and those are good to have. So okay, so let's just plan for next Monday. It seems like there's a pretty unanimous agreement to that being a good plan, and then we'll see where we go from there. Hopefully one class will help us get a little bit caught up and we can move forward. My own feeling is that section we made it through tonight was the hard stuff to get through. The rest of the chapter isn't completely breezy easy, but it's a lot easier than what we just looked at tonight. So, so all right, let's go ahead and do some dedication prayers to conclude this. If you do have additional questions from tonight, maybe even send them to me. I think most of you have my email address, and I'll try to answer them individually, or I will hold on to them till next week. All right. You're all too kind in your comments. I'm doing the best I can with working through this stuff myself and trying to figure out a way to present it without it becoming too complicated. So let's do the dedication prayers. The first one that's on the screen there, that is dedicating all this positive potential for the best possible result, ourselves to attain enlightenment and help all beings to attain that state. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Then this next verse, which is all about bodhicitta, that motivation we had at the beginning of tonight, and how important it is that we nurture and grow that so that we can continue on our path. And moreover, how important it is that all beings develop this mind. If all beings were in that altruistic intention of wanting to benefit all beings, well then, amazing world we would live in, right? So let's generate that thought with regard to all sentient beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then let's go ahead and go down, to these short, brief, long life prayers, beginning with His Holiness. As we recite these, think that we're dedicating for the good health and long lives of all our spiritual guides. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for our spiritual director, Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then lastly, dedicate for any beings that you're holding in your heart right now that are experiencing difficulties in their life, obstacles, illness, dying, or who have died recently. Send this positive energy out to these beings so that they can be free from all of their suffering and find true peace and happiness. And may all beings find perfect peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much for joining tonight. And again, the one other thing I'll mention that's not in what the registration resources that you'll get if you haven't registered is that we're using His Holiness's book. It was originally published as Healing Anger. It's been republished as Practicing Patience. His Holiness the Dalai Lama's book, that's a commentary on chapter 6, and I quote from that occasionally, but if you're reading that along with it, Sheila's holding up the new version. Okay, good. So if you aren't if you can read ahead on that, that can be really useful, because then you've sort of digested some of the concepts before we come into class and can work with it as we go through. So good. All right, everyone. Again, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Don.